direction that the Senate do now adjourn. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. It's a great pleasure to rise tonight to speak about a very important industry to Australia and particularly to Queensland. And thank you to Senator Nash, who has now finished her phone conversation. I appreciate that, Minister. The industry I want to speak about is sugar. Sugar has been a historically, traditionally and still currently an extremely important industry to Queensland, but it's also very important to the whole nation. It actually, despite being concentrated largely in Queensland and northern New South Wales, is our second largest export crop of all, just behind wheat, and it gets export revenue for this country of about $2 billion a year. So it is very, very important. Indeed, about 80 to 85% of our sugar we produce every year goes to export markets. There's about 4,400, I'm told, cane-growing families in Australia, which support thousands of jobs beyond that as well. About 40,000 indirect jobs then are provided by the sugar industry, the milling industry and related industries. We produce around 35 million tonnes a year on 380,000 hectares. Now, this industry at the moment is in quite a bit of transition and change, and when that happens, we need to be very mindful of the impact of that. We need to be mindful of whether the regulations and laws we have are fit for purpose, given those changes that are occurring. And lots of change is happening right now in the industry. There's about 24 mills, which produce sugar in this country, but overwhelmingly, the ownership of those mills is concentrated in the hands of just two major companies. While there's 7 different companies who own those 24 mills, by production, based on tonnes produced, around 53% of the tonnes produced of cane in this country are now owned by one company, a company called Wilmar, who's Singaporean-owned. So they've got about half the market. A Thai company called Metropole, who now own Maryborough Sugar, produce another 10%. So more than 60% of our sugar is produced by just two companies. It's actually very analogous, very similar to the situation we have in retail markets now, where about 60 to 70% of groceries or packaged goods are sold by two companies. Now, this puts growers themselves in quite an invidious position. They therefore only have really a couple of companies to sell their sugar to. Indeed, it's worse than that, because while 63% of the market is owned by these two companies, the reality of sugar growing in a district is it's constrained to that district. Sugar is not a market based on a country. It's not a market that's even based on a state. It is a market based on the local area and the local conditions and the local mill. And that's because when sugar stands in the field, when it gets to maturity, every month you don't harvest that crop, the sugar content of that crop falls. So you need to get it off. It's perishable in the ground, not just out of the ground. And to get it off, you need to get it to a mill as soon as you can. And that means, economically, you really can only send it to the mill closest to your farm. So the reality is, for most cane growers, they've got one mill to sell to and one only. And they're put in a monopolistic, or actually in the economic jargon, a monopsonistic position because they've only got one buyer of their product. Now, that has worked despite that anti-competitive position in the past, because there has been a level of cooperation and joint ownership of sugar facilities between millers and growers. So until recently, until 1999, indeed, the Queensland legislation actually gave cane growers around 2/3 of the ownership of the crop. So they would, whatever the price was received for that crop at the end, they generally receive around 2/3 of the revenue. Likewise, they joint own. Well, we did get rid of that regulation. That's not there in the law now. But even after that, the growers co-own the sugar marketing body with the mills. So cane growers own about 50% of Queensland Sugar Limited, who market sugar to overseas companies. That gives them a level of control and ownership, and makes sure that the mills, who are clearly in a very strong bargaining position, don't abuse that position. Now, that is has been proposed to change. That has been proposed to change originally by Wilmar, but then Metropole and other mills have come on board. COFCO, who own Tully Sugar, have come on board to say they want to end that arrangement. They don't want to market their sugar through this joint company. through QSL. They want to take, Wilmar wants to take the sugar that they process and sell it through their own company. That's going to particularly put cane growers in a very, very invidious position in terms of negotiating with those companies. So we need to look. We should be looking at whether the regulatory structure is right, given that change in potentially market dynamics. And the Senate is doing an inquiry into these issues right now. A couple of weeks ago, I was up in a place called Babinda, which is not too far from Cairns, just south of Cairns. And actually I went to a smaller place called Ballindon Kerr, which is not really even a town, it's just a little village, there's a hall, and around 30 or 40 cane growers turned up on a Sunday morning. Most of us would still be in bed. I wish I had still been in bed, but on a Sunday morning they came down to tell me why this is such a bad idea. And they are rightly very concerned about the changes that have been proposed. And I just want to make this point, that if Wilmar and other companies want to change the market landscape, then we should look again at the regulations to make sure we don't need to make any changes to the regulatory landscape in response to any changes that have been made. Because if cane growers are put in a less powerful negotiating position, well, we need to look again at whether the provisions in the Competition Consumer Act actually protect their bargaining position. Now, one thing that was put to me at this meeting and has now been put forward in submissions by cane growers and others is that why don't we have a code of conduct under the Competition and Consumer Act which protects their position, ensures that they have a fair, transparent and resolvable negotiating position with mills. Now, just in this place a couple of months ago, the government tabled a regulation for a grain code of conduct. And I know it's very important to Senator Nash's constituents in her part of the world, but in fact there's not that much difference between the issues in the grain markets and those in sugar markets. In grain markets, there is usually only one bulk exporter of wheat through a terminal like Brisbane or Newcastle or Adelaide, and therefore the grain growers are put in a very tough position when they try and negotiate with GrainCorp or Viterra or AWB. So looking at that market structure, we've decided that we need a code of conduct. We need some kind of arrangements in place which ensure that there is an equal or at least transparent bargaining process between growers and bulk wheat exporters. That is exactly the same position, almost, as what cane growers are in. Indeed, I'd say cane growers are in a worse position because you can store your grain, you can use your own, well, not your own trucks necessarily, but you can contract with other trucks. You can hold over your grain to other years. It's not perishable, doesn't reduce in quality. And of course, there is a larger domestic market for grain, at least on the eastern coast, which there isn't for sugar. So they're in a worse position, but we have no specific protection for cane growers at a federal government level. Now, until now, I don't necessarily think we needed that protection because of the cooperative structure in the marketplace. But if that cooperative structure is removed, well, maybe we need to relook again at that. And maybe we should be looking at grain markets and how they're regulated to see if that's something that should be translated into sugar markets. And I think more generally, Mr Acting Deputy President, we need to be very careful. Now, the farming sector has changed in the last couple of decades. There has been increasing corporatisation, there has been increasing foreign investment, there are increasing issues around, well, how can the hundreds and thousands, or about 135,000 farmers in this country, negotiate with just a few big corporations to buy or market their products? They don't have the bargaining position that they do. When I was up on this trip, I went to a place called Mareeba. That was the next day, and they do grow a bit of sugar, but they didn't talk sugar there. There was talk to some horticulturists, and I said to them, "Why don't you guys cooperate? Why can't you get together and effectively do what the Labor Party do and go on strike and get a better price?" And they said, "Yeah, we tried that a few years ago." And three of us who were main growers in Mareeba, we all said we're not going to sell to the Cairns marketplace. We're going to stop selling. So next Saturday, no one drive down to Cairns and sell their product. Well, they said that the guy that left at 4:30 in the morning drove past the two others who were already coming back from Cairns that morning. It's very hard for farmers to cooperate because there are so many of them. There's always an incentive for some to do deals outside of a cooperative framework. And given that, we need to recognise that marketplace, ensure we have the kind of laws in place that restrict those with too high a level of market power from abusing that position, and limiting Australian farmers' ability to make a decent return on their work and their investment.